This is Space Minds by SpaceNews. In this week's episode of Space Minds, host David Ariosto speaks with Will Bruey, CEO and co-founder of Varda Space Industries, a company developing in-space pharmaceutical manufacturing. Varda is pushing the boundaries of drug development by leveraging microgravity to create new formulations not possible on Earth, bringing them back through its own reentry vehicles.
Will Bruey, CEO and co-founder at Varda Space Industries. It's a company that focuses on in-space manufacturing as well as a host of other things. It's great to have you on the pod.
Hey, David, thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah. So let's do a little bit of a primer here. Just walk me through a little bit what Varda is and what Varda hopes to be as we kind of go through this maturation process with this new age in commercial space.
Yeah, absolutely. Varda formulates drugs in microgravity because the lack of gravity allows you to create new drug formulations that would otherwise be impossible on Earth due to gravity. So when I say formulation, I mean like, is the drug administered via an IV bag formulation or a shot formulation or a pill formulation, inhalable formulation? So what we do is we develop formulations in space and then bring them back to the patient. And a lot of that is building the reentry vehicle that manufactures the drugs and then returns them to Earth.
And you've done this already. This is not sort of on the the PowerPoint or the pitch deck. This has been accomplished, which is, I think this is kind of the not only the fact that this is in practical application now, but the fact that this is such a clear example of tapping into an existing market with technologies that actually might be better in space in some capacities. I wonder if you can kind of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you put it really well in the sense that this has been a business waiting to happen for decades. People have done microgravity research on crystallization, which is a big part of pharmaceutical formulation development, and how it's different in microgravity for decades on the International Space Station. And there was always an obvious business case here that just didn't close because for two big reasons. First is launch cost, of course, it wasn't economical, but even more than cost, and which doesn't get enough attention, is cadence. And the fact that even though launch right now is certainly more expensive than FedEx, shipping to space is now just shipping in the sense of it's a reliable, deterministic flight, whereas that just didn't exist before Falcon 9. And
let me stop you right there. Before we kind of get onto the broader nature of this and like the technology and all these other fascinating facets, I almost kind of want to take a quick step back in here in the sense that like the nature of what our generation and future generations will take for granted in regard to how it used to be, just even the purview of the fact that like space launch used to be the purview of nation states, right? Just like millions upon millions of dollars. And that is so fundamentally different now. And like sort of the emergence of these new ecosystems is, I don't know, it's just kind of like this new factory floor in a way in low Earth orbit and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. The previous generation thought of launch as, like you said, a national effort. It was like Christopher Columbus going to the New World was the analogy. But the next generation, so our kids will be thinking about space more like the ocean, where it's just this big vast thing that's actually pretty close by. And we're stuck in between right now in the transitional period.
Yeah. So space itself like offers these sort of this sort of unique domain in terms of how sort of the lattice structure works in terms of the development of cells. And I wonder if you can kind of explain a little bit why it's a better suited environment for pharmaceuticals, because this is like I've talked to a number of people, and pharmaceuticals is one of these things that always comes up. It's in situ manufacturing, it's orbital services, it's deorbiting to some extent, it's data centers, but it almost always kind of goes back to what can we produce in space that has a market on Earth that you can kind of tap into, and drugs always come to the forefront, and Varda is clearly at the vanguard of that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the way I think about it is gravity is a fundamental force of physics. There's only four fundamental forces, and you learn that in high school. And gravity being one of them is fixed at 1g on Earth, whereas it goes to microgravity when you're in orbit. And the only way to get to microgravity is to go to orbit. And so the key thing to understand here is that the way we think about gravity is like a knob, like a parameter that you can
Mm,
change during the formulation process or during the manufacturing process, in the same way that you might change temperature during a manufacturing process to create a different outcome. So Varda wants to introduce a gravity knob to the pharmaceutical industry for them to turn to create new formulations in the same way that the refrigeration industry introduced a temperature knob last century. So,
right.
cold doesn't necessarily make drugs better per se, and neither does microgravity.
Yeah.
It's simply, one of the invalid questions I'll get a lot is like, oh, how does microgravity make drugs better? And it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily. It's just a
Mm,
knob, just like a temperature knob. But we're introducing that knob to be used to create new drug formulations, like changing a formulation from an IV bag to a subcutaneous shot for better patient experience.
right. But there's also these hurdles along the way in terms of just, not only the cost to launch, but radiation exposure and just sort of the very nature of just like the sheer rattle of how these things kind of operate on their way in deorbiting. And so like you've clearly kind of worked out the math in a way that I don't even necessarily mean from an engineering perspective, but from dollars and cents question mark. This walk me through how this is a viable market.
Yeah. So the what we do is we're only creating the active ingredients in our reentry capsule.
Yeah.
So most of the drugs that you will take will have either sugar inside or other excipients or saline solution in the case of a shot or an IV bag. We're not
Yeah.
shipping those to space and back. We're only shipping the active ingredients to space and back. And so, from first principles, microgravity gives you a way to create new chemical outcomes that you couldn't create on Earth.
Mm,
And the most valuable chemicals on Earth with that also have a large market are pharmaceuticals. And so that's why it's a clear first use case for microgravity manufacturing. What we do is you can kind of think of I got asked a interesting question of like, because I get this question a lot, like explain how this works as a business. And I got asked a question by an investor the other day that really helped me figure out how to articulate this. Well, he asked, well, what's the most confusing part about Varda for folks to wrap their heads around? And I thought about it for a second, and it's the space aspect. So, and because it throws you for a loop, like if we just had a zero gravity oven in the back of the lab,
sure.
we said, hey, we have this oven that can do chemistry that no other oven can do, you know, and then we say, hey, we're just a typical formulation development company, right? Biotech company. I don't think I would be on this podcast or many other podcasts. It's too simple, not interesting enough. But that's really what we are. And so, right now, we're increasing the cadence of our microgravity oven in the back of the lab. Pay no attention to the rocket behind the curtain kind of thing. And so in that analogy, it really kind of helps understand what the business looks like, because right now, this year we're only running our microgravity oven 4 times a year, and it costs a few $1,000,000 to run.
Mm,
Uh, and next year we want to bring those costs down and increase that cadence, and while keeping in balance the demand for the oven and the supply of how many often we run that oven, and keeping those two things in balance so that we're a healthy business as we grow over the next decade. And so the way the business works is, well, you might use your zero gravity oven in the back of the lab for different use cases this year than you will in 5 years.
mm,
Because it'll be a lower cost and higher cadence then than it is today. So what we're using it for today is really laying the foundation of determining which drugs we will make at scale, creating patent protections around them, and learning, and also selling those learnings to our pharmaceutical partners. And so then, a few years go by. Now our microgravity oven is less expensive to run, and we can run it more often. And that'll change the answer of, okay, now we might use it for scaling up actual doses for clinical trials. And, a couple of
yeah.
years after that, now we have enough cadence to actually hit the market and that sort of thing. So the drug development cycle is, it takes on average about 10 years for a drug to go from molecule to, FDA approved and in someone's body. And that is a whole decade is plenty of time to scale up spacecraft production and cadence.
It
And
is,
so
but I
you have
wonder,
a real
if I just
there.
jump in here, like
Yeah.
part of the scaling up is not necessarily incumbent on you as a company, though. I mean, I kind of foresee it to some extent, some degree of bottlenecks that exist in terms of existing launch infrastructure. This is something that SpaceX, your sort of former employer has talked about quite a bit, as well as others within launch sectors. So, like I wonder in the context of this like rapid growth, this convergence of technologies, there still has to be sort of a pairing with the federal government here in terms of existing infrastructures, whether it's at Cape Canaveral or any number of the facilities at Vandenberg or down in Texas. Like it, part of these things don't necessarily work without taxpayer buy-in. Is that sort of a fair statement?
Yes and no. So,
Maybe not work,
yeah.
but like the scale of it doesn't get to where it potentially could get to.
Yeah, uh, I think there is certain. So I'll zoom out for a sec. The
Yeah.
point you made about a lot needs to change for a space enabled or a microgravity enabled formulation to get into a human body years from now. That's very true. Not for even things like, for example, the FDA will require for life-saving drugs for you to have a plan for redundancy in your supply chain, right? That's hard to do if we're the only space
Gosh, I didn't
manufacturing
even think
company.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a ton of small things like that that need to reorient or be addressed in order for mass production of microgravity enabled drug formulations.
Yeah.
In the near term, though, I'm not too concerned about the ability to launch vehicles and in the near term. But I do agree with you that I see in a few years there could be a capacity issue. But Starship had a successful launch yesterday,
Yeah, no,
and
this is an
so
interesting time to be
I
talking
think
about
that'll yeah, so I think that'll help fill the gap. And the reason I say that is because ultimately, the mission of SpaceX is to go to Mars. And I think Starlink, if I had a gun to my head, I think the most valid rationale for Starlink's existence, other than, ubiquitous global internet, is cool in and of itself and certainly a worthwhile endeavor.
that.
But it is also a response to the lack of elasticity in the launch market that did not respond to reusable rockets. And so Varda is really kind of the first true elastic response to reusable rockets that I can think of, where on average every day or per day, there's 3 Starlink satellites launched. If we're launching 3 of our microgravity bioreactors and re-entering them 3 per day, Varda's doing real well. And so the
Florida's
proof of
doing real well.
concept is
I guess
already there.
wonder in the context that like let's say down the road you're doing some sort of groundbreaking pharmaceutical development in orbit. You come up with some sort of cancer solving drug, and then everybody on Earth wants it, and then now you're dealing with supply chain issues and questions of just sort of over demand and the nature of like how that actually kind of manifests both within like the commercial capacity to meet those demands, but also like what you mentioned, the regulatory aspects and the demands for redundancies and all of these things. So it kind of opens up this vast amount of possibilities, but also some potential like hurdles that you're going to have to figure out a way to overcome.
Yeah, I think if we have the problem of engineering more cadence in order to cure cancer, I think we've already won at that
That's
point.
fair.
It is funny in the sense that I think that the biggest barriers or the most uncertain barriers to microgravity enabled drug formulations are not the actual engineering of the spacecraft engineering aspect. I think that if we line up a train of reentry vehicles primed with a life-saving drug pharmaceutical to Vandenberg or to the Cape, and say, hey, we're ready with more demand for launch. I would, or maybe to Brownsville or whatever. I would be shocked if the launch supply chain did not respond. As my former
It's
employer,
fair. It's
I
a good
think that they
problem to
would
have.
kick into gear pretty quick.
It's a good problem to have. I mean, speaking about the
Yeah.
engineering, I want to just like take a moment to sort of acknowledge what has happened with Starship, because I mean, you did spend 5 years of your career at SpaceX, and just, it's interesting to me to kind of like I talk to different people in the space industry, and so many of them have kind of like burnished their chops either at NASA or SpaceX, and then kind of just, kind of put in their time, sort of learn the ropes from these either legacy. I mean, it's funny to me even call SpaceX a legacy place, because it's certainly not. I mean, it's been around for, 2+ decades, but there's like, it almost seems like there's a training ground in some of these places that then sort of spin off into to other companies, and that seems to be what would happen with you, and I mean, clearly Starship is a manifestation of that company. So just curious to kind of get your thoughts about all that.
Yeah, so there two things. First is, with any vanguard of an industry, you'll see kind of spin-offs like I remember visiting Detroit, and at Ford Motors you see some of the original folks that were there, like Chrysler was there, right? And
Yeah.
so there's so nothing new there. And the way I think about Starship is, the way we at Varda think about launch is shipping, right? And I'll explain why that's so fundamentally awesome in a second. But when Starship comes online, or when more launch providers come online to help create pricing pressure for lower costs, to me, that doesn't really change the game fundamentally. It just means better, more reliable, lower cost shipping. So, when Starship launches, it's like, oh, sweet, that's a new semi truck from FedEx.
Yeah,
Like, it's awesome. Don't get me wrong. It helps our business model. It helps our margins, but it doesn't like change how Varda thinks per se,
sure.
or how a business would think, just because there's a new semi truck model coming out of FedEx. So
Yeah.
um, but the reason why that's so fundamentally awesome is because here's a series of dominoes that I think we're igniting at Varda. So first, bring home a small economical reentry vehicle, right? There's only two flying commercial reentry vehicles today, Dragon and Varda's capsule.
This is something I was going to talk to you about, because
Yeah.
I'm guessing where you're going is hypersonics, but so the multi-case use of how your business is
Oh no,
operating.
I'm excited to talk about that too. But no, so I'll
Okay.
go through these dominoes really quickly, but I think
Okay.
this is actually the most exciting part. So one is have a cheap reentry vehicle that's made for in and out of objects, where creating microgravity manufacturing is economical. All right, that domino has fallen. What happens next? Next is with our first drug, we will create perpetual demand for launch. And why this is fundamentally interesting is because right now every other satellite provider uh, their demand for launch eventually saturates when their constellation is populated, right? Either Earth observation, or even Starlink will eventually saturate the internet. And in case, when do you what do you rationalize continued launch with? But for Varda, since we're making actual consumable goods, we have to continue launching. Our constellation never populates, so we create a perpetual demand for launch.
Right.
And then, that's the next domino to fall, is actually a positive feedback loop on perpetual demand for launch, because right now, there's only certain amount of drugs that we can make in microgravity because of the unit economics. But in servicing the first few drugs that we can, and creating that perpetual demand for launch, we get economies of scale, which helps lower our threshold of dollar per kilogram where a drug makes sense. So
Sure.
fundamentally, you get, the more drugs you make means the more drugs you can make, and that is a positive feedback loop that drives launch costs down and cadence up, and the number of drugs we can make up. So now you've got a perpetual demand with a positive feedback loop that's causing more and more cadence. And then finally, and this is where it gets really exciting. So if you understand those two dominoes, now, stepping aside for a second and thinking about a traditional CDMO or contract manufacturing organization in the pharmaceutical industry, where drugs are manufactured, you go in there, there's people on the factory floor. It's not a lights out manufacturing operation, right? So there are people moving things from one station to another, checking on the equipment. And the reason why there are still humans in a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant, and most pharmaceutical manufacturing plants, is because there's a threshold where it actually it's cheaper to hire a human than to build some sort of robot or automated system beyond that, right? So what's very cool is, as this positive feedback loop pushes our dollar per kilogram low to that threshold, then you truly think about space as just Milwaukee. It's just another place. And so there's no
Base is
reason to believe.
Milwaukee. Yeah. I wonder though, I mean, will that continue on? because there are sunk costs associated with sort of robotics and the development of AI and sort of the nature of human workforces and like where they fit into the broader loop. I mean, what you're saying that might be true today. I wonder what this looks like 5, 10, 15 years from now as we like look at a mature industry. You look at sort of reduction of launch costs. You look at more companies trying to kind of like, make their hay within that market, and then looking at sort of those fixed costs, those recurring costs that might be a labor force from this in terms of all the everything else. I mean, this is not a question necessarily for space or for Varda,
Yeah,
really, but
exactly. Yes.
frankly, it's a question for all of us. Um,
No, you said it perfectly. Is that it is not, it's not a space question. Like as our launch costs go down and our cadences go up, space becomes Milwaukee. Is just another place. And now, so the only difference between space and here will be the costs to get there. And so as those costs become in family with the cost to get anywhere else, we will be susceptible, in the space industry to the automation that'll happen in any manufacturing plant,
sure.
but it's not unique to space at that point.
Well, also maybe just the radiation and the lack of oxygen up there,
True, but I mean, if it's not that expensive to take up some scuba gear, I mean, I'm downplaying it certainly to some extent, but the reason why those sorts of things are expensive is because you don't have economies of scale yet. But
Sure.
there's no like flux capacitor, or like if you think about the equipment that's being shipped up, there's no first principles cost that's prohibitive. It's just the fact that the numbers are too low to take advantage of scale.
Well, I think this is one of the more fascinating things. I mean, we started this conversation talking about sort of the legacy of the nature of the industry being the purview of nation states, and for so long, space had been dominated by the realms of engineers and physicists and those who kind of like focus specifically on the engineering aspects of this now. And now you have the heads of several major space companies that have software backgrounds. You have more MBAs that are involved in this. They're making comments like it seemed to dovetail more with ROI in terms of the nature of what they're building. It's not necessarily can you build it. It's like can we build this in a way that's sustainable, that creates a market or that taps into existing markets, which I think is a big part of what Varda's business model is. The other side of this, though, is that in this newfangled commercial sector, you have multiple use cases, and so it's if you have this reentry vehicle, and you're bringing back pharmaceuticals that are potentially heading to market, why not use that vehicle for something else upon reentry? And this is where the conversation goes to hypersonics. And I wonder if you can kind of tell us a little bit more about like where Varda fits into that.
Yeah, so Varda's reentry vehicle is the cheapest way to go from space to Earth by far. And
Because it's not human rated. That because of
it's
the
not human rated. Exactly. It's small. It's not human rated. It fits into a rideshare envelope. And the reason we built it that way is for the unit economics of manufacturing pharmaceuticals in orbit. Turns out if you build something that's the cheapest way to go from space to Earth, it's also the cheapest way to go Mach 25 because that's the speed at which a reentry vehicle will hit the atmosphere. So the cheapest way to go Mach 25 10 years ago was by a dedicated launch, right?
yeah.
So the business model for Varda, I call it Delta V arbitrage. Since you mentioned MBA, maybe I'll be able to get away with this terminology. But we're basically there's an arb for speed from Falcon 9 or a rideshare launch in general. So it's similar to if I went over to the Air Force and said, "Hey, I can get you to Mach 25 without a rocket." They look at each other like, "Okay, this guy's insane." But
Yeah.
what I'm doing, right, is what we're doing at Varda is we're buying rideshare costs, and then once we're in orbit, when we hit the atmosphere, we're going that fast. So basically, long story short, is the cheapest way to go Mach 25 today is to go to space first, and then you're already high up and going fast, and then come back rather than just go straight to Mach 25.
I don't think most people realize how fast Mach 25 is. So hypersonics are defined as anything that goes faster than Mach 5. And then we're talking about 5 times the speed of just the baseline of what hypersonics is. So like the operational sort of nature of how fast these things are going, those potential military applications and other potential applications. I mean, it just strikes me like we're kind of at the vanguard of this whole brand new era in terms of how we travel, how we communicate, and companies like Varda seem to be in the mix in a way that just starting to kind of get started. But I wonder when we talk about pharmaceuticals, when can I buy something at a pharmacy that it's actually, when does it hit market, right? Like that, I
Yeah,
think that's the question, because that is the moment, right? You've proven this, it's possible. It's no longer, it's off the pitch room floor. You're operational, you have vehicles. Um, when do you start, in terms of your business case, when does this start to hit the market?
so I think that Varda will not be the long pole in the schedule, if you will, in the next few years. And then it'll just be the same answer as it is for today, where it takes 10 years to go from drug molecule to the market. Yes, we do microgravity manufacturing in that part of that process, but that part is not the driving part of the schedule, if you will.
Right.
So, and we want to start doing reformulations of current drugs now, which means that's more expedited approval process, because if you already know the drug molecule is safe and effective,
Yeah.
then changing the formulation is a lower lift. And so, long story short, we're looking for having that occur at least into the clinic by the end of the decade.
Oh, okay. All right. What was the origin story in all this? This is like this is kind of there's an aha moment in all these things that the sort of confluence of meeting of the minds, and people come together. It's like, well, we could do this. But I'm curious, with your background, and like where pharmaceuticals came into play here. Was it just sort of like you were looking at the different pillars of existing market and saying, like, we can corner this one?
Yeah, yeah. So let's see. It's a tale as old as time. Science meets economics. Economics falls in love with science, and the idea of microgravity manufacturing, because of that science that was demonstrated, for decades. So that's really the origin of it. And then Delian, my co-founder,
Yeah.
who works at Founders Fund, they were the first outside capital into SpaceX. So he's been tracking reusable rockets for quite some time. And when they became repeatable, it was just obvious that microgravity manufacturing now pencils out as a positive unit economics
Yeah.
case. And so, back actually
So
very,
it's just purely a sort of a look at the numbers, the business case, and just
it was a look at yeah, he was looking at the right numbers at the right time and came up with the idea, called me up actually exactly 5 years and 1 day ago. We just had our
Oh,
co-founder
wow.
anniversary yesterday.
Happy
And was,
anniversary.
yeah, basically was, hey, I think manufacturing in space makes sense now. What should we do? And so,
Yeah.
it was as simple, like there, the logic is very simple behind pharmaceuticals. And, I kind of said it earlier, but the from first principles, we have a unique way to manipulate chemical systems in microgravity. Great. Which chemical systems? Well, the most valuable per unit kilogram, that also have a large market, are pharmaceuticals. And they also have a huge positive impact on people's lives. It's like, all right, this is a match made in heaven, no pun intended.
Yeah. And this, yeah, that's a good one. That's nice. Did you just come up with that?
No.
All right. All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, you derailed me in terms of my next question. It's like, oh man, I gotta do to that bit there. But I wonder though, like your business tends to center on Earth's orbits, right? Everything that's kind of happening in that, in situ manufacturing and pharmaceuticals and reentry and hypersonics and all these things. When that becomes more developed, if and when that becomes more developed, do you see this as sort of a baseline for sort of this leapfrog approach where you start to develop, you know, low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, geosynchronous in more profound ways? Then cislunar space becomes more of a question, lunar services market, like this gradual expansion out in terms of both technical capabilities, existing markets, which I think is the real question, and then the capacity to kind of execute on both of those.
Yeah, so this is a great question in the sense that it kind of picks up with that domino analogy I was making earlier. Like the next step of it, of course, is when um when it is as uh as cheap to go to space as it is to go to anywhere else. There will be a time when it does make more sense to have a human on a manufacturing station, just because it's cheaper to put the human there than design more complex automation for the nitty gritty,
Yeah.
just like there is in a manufacturing warehouse today. And so what's really cool is, in about 10 years, and it's very much a when, not an if, when the unit economics work. Like capitalism, hopefully Varda is the winner and is the first there, but if it's not Varda, capitalism this will happen. It's the cat's out of the bag.
Right.
But anyway, 10 years from now, hopefully it's a Varda employee that will go up.
Stamping their punch card on the lunar surface as they gonna work on a fab on
Well,
the South
not
Pole.
quite there. In order to get to lunar, I think we got to get to Leo first. And what I
Yeah,
mean by
no,
that is like,
I'm just being,
remember, yeah, oh, gotcha, yeah, yeah. We're only there for the microgravity. So Leo, Geo, it doesn't matter to us. We just want to be in free fall. So, but what is cool is you're right that there will be a punch card moment where we send an employee up. They're there for about a month. Very similar to an oil rig. You go there for a month, you come home.
right?
But what's fascinating is that we will hit this threshold where, Joe Schmo, who goes up there for a month and comes back down, will have created more value than it cost for his round trip, right? And it's that moment that the invisible hand of the free market lifts us off our home planet, because it's literally more expensive to keep him here or her here than to
Mhm.
ship them up and back to make the money in the microgravity drug factory. And it's at that moment where human activity is cheaper in space than not. And then that's when, okay, now cislunar starts to now, I kid around like when that moment happens, the next person who pitches a cislunar idea will sound only as crazy as Varda sounded 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we'll take the next step into the cosmos.
The development of Varda roughnecks in space. This is
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
it's an interesting construct.
Yep.
Will, I really appreciate you spending the time with us here at Space Minds. You're the CEO and co-founder of Varda Space, and you're up to some very, very interesting things. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David. Hope to talk to you again soon.